No, you're. Hello to anyone joining us. Hello, hello, good morning. Morning, afternoon, somewhere in between. Just going to wait for a few more people to join us and we'll make a start. Very warm welcome to everyone who's with us so far. Just going to give a few more moments now to let some people come in and then I'll do my introductions. A few more moments there. Hello to everyone who's joining so far. Very warm welcome. Okay, let's see what time we have. So 12:01, so I'll make a start. So a very warm welcome to you all joining us today at our Irish in Britain Communications Toolkit webinar. We're delighted to be joined by Malcom Munroe, who is a former senior broadcast journalist with ITN and is a delivery partner for Irish in Britain supporting our team. So Malcom is working with us and has produced a communications toolkit for members and partners, which will be distributed to members. The purpose of today's webinar is to introduce the toolkit, and this session will also be recorded and uploaded into our members area. So attendees, obviously you aren't on screen and your microphones are off, but we encourage participation and Q&A, which you can put in both the Q&A box and the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So in a moment I'll disappear, but I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout. So please do post any engagement there, and I will now go off screen and hand over to Malcom. So over to you, Malcom.
Thanks very much, Aisling, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining today's session. As Aisling said, the purpose today really is to introduce you to a toolkit which has been produced for members and partners of Irish in Britain, and that will be distributed to you at a later date. So the good news is that you will not need to write too much down, because this toolkit you can see there will have more detail than we'll cover today, but today it covers quite a lot of detail. Now, the agenda today, let me just introduce myself so you know where I'm coming from. Aisling mentioned that I was a former journalist, and I was for much of my career, initially in newspapers, because I'm of that age, the ripe old age, where most people who went into journalism went in through newspapers, and I did through the Leicester Mercury, an evening newspaper, but quite quickly moved into broadcasting. And having worked in regional television broadcasting, I ended up at ITN, initially on screen, but then rapidly moved up the management hierarchy and became head of home news and sport for ITN for some years, before I moved into strategic consultancy, advising all sorts of different organizations, and delighted to be working with Irish in Britain. So that's me. This is what we're going to cover today, and quite a lot of detail, but as I say, there'll be more in the toolkit which will be distributed to you later. So, as I mentioned, we have a toolkit, and I'm very mindful when producing this that there's a number of different organisations within the umbrella of Irish in Britain, and some of those organisations are quite well resourced, have quite a lot of people working with you, and will already have quite well established and sophisticated, communications operation, and will also have some kind of strategy for issues management as well, which we're also going to cover today. But so for you, many of this might seem very familiar, whereas other people on this call may well be very small, maybe only 2 or 3 people in the organization, and you might feel that this is all a bit too much of a stretch. But actually, I'm hoping that we've pitched it in a way where there's something for everybody, and everyone will find it useful at different levels. So a lot to get through, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions later if you'd like to. So I guess the first question to ask is, why communicate at all? Because we don't want to communicate just for the sake of it. And classically, the reason that organizations do proactively communicate and sometimes have to reactively communicate is because they want to raise awareness and understanding of what you do. Because if people understand what you do and appreciate what you do and become more familiar with what you do, then they're more likely to support you in what you're trying to achieve. So these are quite useful questions to ask yourself before you embark on any kind of campaign or any outreach external outreach. Who are you trying to reach? Because you aren't necessarily always trying to reach the same audience with every outreach. So that's quite important to be audience centric, as we say, and who you're trying to reach, which won't always be the same. The scattergun approach, where you simply blitz everybody with everything, isn't always very productive. Why do you want to reach them? And that can be for very different reasons. I mean, a classic reason might be that, as many people are in the third sector, you're looking to do some kind of fundraising or to achieve some additional funding. And therefore, you might be trying to reach policymakers, governments, local governments, or you might be trying to reach, for example, lottery distributors if you're looking to try and get some funding through the Heritage Fund or the Community Fund, etc. Or you could be hoping to reach the Irish government, for example. So being audience-centric in your communications is very effective as well. And then you ask yourself, why do they need to know this, and what do they need to know? Because you don't want to send them a load of stuff they don't really need. And crucially, what do you want them to do as a result of receiving your communication? So in the case of, for example, if you were trying to attract more funding, what you want them to do is support you, and preferably sustainably over a period of time. So these are the kind of questions it's quite useful to ask. And then what hopefully you will achieve by doing some effective communication is hopefully achieve a shift from ignorance to knowledge of what you do, in some cases from apathy to interest, in some cases from prejudice to acceptance, occasionally from hostility to empathy or sympathy, and more generally from a misunderstanding about what you do to an understanding of what you do. So in other words, communication can be an extremely useful tool for any organization. You're not just doing it, if you like, to be better known. And when you're thinking about communicating, planning in advance can be an extremely effective way to improve the success of whatever communication you're trying to do. And let me explain that by looking at how a typical newsroom works. And this could be a television newsroom. It could equally be a newspaper newsroom. And basically, the way that large news organizations operate is that they have an input side and an output side. In other words, they bring the news in, they bring the content in, and then they put the content out. So in television terms, the input side will be a planning desk and a news desk, the news desk reacting on the day, the planning desk planning in ahead. Now, the main point of this slide is to make the point that although the news often appears to be spontaneous, reacting to events of the day, actually about 60 or 70% of any bulletin or any newspaper or magazine or increasingly online news sites will have been things that they've thought about in advance, sometimes days in advance, sometimes weeks in advance, and occasionally months in advance, like, for example, a budget, a government budget. So if we can think the same way when we're planning our news, when we're planning our engagement, our external engagement, and think about not what we're going to do today or tomorrow, but to be more proactive, not just firefighting, but thinking weeks and months in advance, that can really increase the effectiveness of what you're trying to achieve. So one thing you'll find in this toolkit is an example of a strategic planning diary. Now, this is very simply a list of opportunities and milestones in going forward. And it's also an update on what the event is, what actions are necessary if you're going to try and exploit that particular milestone, and then a status of where you are at any given time. This is really, really good practice. And these can be set piece events, that things you know are going to happen, or they can be things that you've generated yourself. So if, for example, you've done a membership survey or you've planned a campaign, that isn't dictated, the timing of that isn't dictated by a diary. You can decide when you want to do it. So you might know, for example, you're going to launch a campaign in June or August, and then you've got an additional time to plan ahead. Or it can be something which you can't choose the time, like, for example, St. Patrick's Day, clearly a great opportunity for the Irish community to, capitalize on conversations about what's happening with the Irish community, or to generate their own events as well. For example, in September, the Labour Party are holding their conference in Liverpool. That might be an opportunity if you're looking to do any kind of political engagement, particularly with a city like Liverpool, my own birthplace, by the way, which does have quite a strong Irish community. Or for example, this December, we see the 100th anniversary of the Irish Free State, which preceded the Irish Republic. And there might be something there, an opportunity to comment or something you want to say. So being strategic in that way can be quite effective. And also, when we talk about planning, we sometimes talk about planning materials. To use the sort of PR jargon, we call it collateral, generating materials in advance that you can use when you engage externally. And here's just a few examples, like, for example, the boilerplate. Now, this is a one-paragraph description of your organization. You may already have one of these on your own website. Sometimes people put them at the bottom of their signature on their emails. There's all sorts of different uses for these. And if you are putting out any kind of press release or external engagement or opportunity to comment, a boilerplate at the bottom can be a really, really helpful thing for everybody. For example, if we look at the what you might say is the Irish in Britain boilerplate, that says something like Irish in Britain is a national membership body for Irish community organisations in Britain, providing support and representation for our diverse network and championing our community's interests. We bring together many different groups and individuals, share expertise, represent their interests, and campaign for and support the growth and well-being of our community. So nice, neat, concise, can be used many, many times. Case studies are always great because journalists love case studies. And if you're talking about something, for example, the recent Irish in Britain campaign to promote the vaccine program and to encourage members of the Irish community in Britain, some of whom have shown some reluctance to get vaccinated. A case study, for example, a program, an event that was held in Liverpool, where I believe somewhere around 90 plus people got vaccinated. Some of those wouldn't have done without the campaign, and we're happy to say that. Then you can give one or two nice little examples there of Mr. Jones or Mrs. Jones, who didn't really feel it was necessary, but then was persuaded of the benefits, both for themselves and for the community, and they decided to have the jab. Now, that is quite a nice little case study, and it saves the journalist digging around to find their own. Nice little concise fact sheets, one side of A4 usually, on a certain number of issues that are familiar to your organization, can be always a helpful thing when you're briefing journalists, or not just journalists, by the way, but other stakeholders as well. It's also quite helpful if for any reason you find an issue where you are being criticized or someone's having a go at you for some reason, to have those kind of fact sheets to set the record straight can be very helpful. And the other thing is that if you're putting out quotes from your chief exec or from someone in your organization or a board member, what can really slow things up is getting those quotes approved when you're responding to a breaking issue. So if you've got 3 or 4 quotes already approved in advance on certain known predictable issues, that can be really helpful when you're responding to a breaking issue. So the press release. Now, the press release is not the be-all and end-all of communications by any means. And in some ways, they're considered rather old-fashioned now, although they still have their place. And as I'll talk about later, a press release that's connected also to a social media campaign can be very effective. But if you are going to put out a press release on any particular issue, sometimes people get very frustrated. They send out the release, no one picks it up, no one covers it. Here's a few of the reasons why they may not run it. One is it's simply you've sent it to the wrong platform, the wrong audience. It's not relevant to their readers or their viewers or their followers online. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with the release. It's just not right for them. And clearly, there are many different media that you could target. There is the media in Ireland, the Irish national media or regional media. There is the national media in the UK that has Irish editions. For example, the Times newspaper has a full Irish edition, which I now read much more regularly than I used to. So that's one reason. Sometimes a release can be too pluggy. You've overcooked it, if you like. You've made it an advert, not a press release, and journalists don't like that. By all means, reference your organization, make sure your organization is profiled in the story, but don't overcook it because it becomes counterproductive sometimes. Timing. Sending out a press release on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. before a bank holiday weekend is not likely to get much coverage. Or if it arrives too late, then the journalist will say, oh, I might have done that story if I'd known about it earlier. If it's so badly written, because journalists don't tend to read the whole release, if they get frustrated with it, they'll often give up. Then that can count against it. And if sometimes the story is simply buried in detail, there's a great story in there somewhere, but you wouldn't know it from the top line or from the top line of the press release, and therefore, because the journalist doesn't go any further, it falls on stony ground. So there's no absolute strict, certain way of writing a press release, but here is some helpful thoughts. A press release generally has a headline, a bit like a newspaper headline. Now, it's not likely that the journalist will use your headline. They'll write their own, or if it's a newspaper, the sub-editors will write something. But the headline is a great way of selling in the story. So it's worth spending a bit of time to make it an interesting headline, even if they don't use it. The first paragraph is critical, really. It doesn't need to get bogged down in detail, but it has to have the story. And a little tip that I often use is I will write the first paragraph. I will try to capture the story. But then when I've written the rest of the press release and filled in all that detail, I then go back to the first paragraph and perhaps revisit it and maybe rewrite it if I need to. So that should capture everything about the story, which makes it interesting and topical and makes something that people will want to read. And then the second, and if you need to, third or fourth paragraph, that's where you fill in the detail. The where, the when, the how, the what. That comes in then. You don't need that in the first paragraph. That's all about the story itself. The quotes paragraph will usually follow that. Now, we all understand that there is a certain amount of protocol required in large organizations, and sometimes you have to quote lots of different people, the chief executive, maybe a partner, a stakeholder, maybe not a board member. So for protocol reasons and internal politics, you do need to have more than one quote. But the reality is, for the media, they're probably just looking for one quote. So the one that you really want to run should be the first one that you use. But what the quote does do, unlike the rest of the release, it does give you the opportunity to introduce the point of view, some color, some comment that perhaps the rest of the release is not so easy to do. So it can be quite good for that sort of giving a point of view in the quote, which backs up the story. And then finally, the final paragraph should be a bit of a so what, if you like, just a recap or capturing the essence of what the story is all about. So that if it does actually end up in print, you've managed to land the so what of the story as well as the detail. And then all the other information, whether there's pictures available, whether someone's available for interview, maybe some background information or some information on health or other social affairs that you want to include, that can go in the note to editors. In a bullet point form, you do not need to turn that into fine prose. That's just there to fill in the other bits of information that the audience might need. And the beauty of putting it there is it doesn't clog up or clutter up the release itself, which should be relatively easy to read and to the point. The format of a press release can be quite helpful. Put at the top the date and time of the release. If it's for immediate release, it can go out straight away. Put for immediate release. If it needs to go out late, you've pegged it to the publication of a report, or you've pegged it to an event, and therefore you're sort of embargoing it. Generally, journalists will respect an embargo. It gives them time to prepare and get some pictures and do their part. But have that in there. But don't use embargoes unnecessarily, because that irritates journalists. You should include the press release in the body of the email as well as an attachment, because so many journalists now read their emails on their device, their phone generally, and therefore they're not likely to open an attachment. But if it's in the body of an email, they will read it. Always include, I think, out of office details as well as the main office number you work from, because nothing is more frustrating for a journalist if they decide to do the story and do a bit of homework, for example, in the evening or over the weekend, and they can't get hold of anybody. So some people are a bit reluctant to use mobiles. I understand that, but I think generally speaking, the journalist will appreciate it. At the end of the interview, put ends. It's just jargon. That's what journalists do, it tells everybody else that is the end of the release. You know, there's no need to turn over the page, no need to look elsewhere. That's it. And if you can offer interviews or pictures or access to video, that can be very helpful to journalists who are very stretched these days. That the world of media is fragmented, it operates on lower budgets with lower resource. And so any help you can give them with pictures and things like that, it will be appreciated. Selling in a story, people are always terrified to call a news desk, and I understand why. They often get shortchanged, which is unfair. The first thing to do is make sure that a major story hasn't just happened in their sector. You know, a bomb just hasn't gone off in London or something like that, because that they really won't have time to talk to you at that moment. So pick your moment. If your story is for the future, and very often it will be, then don't go to the main news desk, go to the planning desk. And most large organizations will have a planning desk. They will run a diary. They'll find your call very helpful. Do a bit of homework before you make the call. Have your top line ready to go. You know, don't try and think it up off the cuff when the journalist unexpectedly suddenly says yes. If you're calling a correspondent directly, ask them if they've got the time to talk. They'll appreciate that. And also, if they've written stuff in the past that you've liked, it's nice to mention that. Oh, I saw your piece last week. I saw your report last week. Because journalists often operate in a vacuum. They're being sent from pillar to the post by horrible news editors, like I used to be. And therefore, they always like it when they know that people have read and liked their stuff. If they clearly are too busy, then don't pursue it then. Just say, oh, can I call you back later, or send an email. And don't show fear. You know, journalists get a lot of calls. They get bombarded. People are always trying to push stories at them. And if they sense that you don't really want to do it, they might sort of hone in on that. So, you know, be confident, be friendly. And remember, you are helping them. They need stories. You know, you are helping them. And good journalists will know that and appreciate that. Which brings us on to social media, which in this day and age is absolutely essential, but can also work hand in glove with mainstream media. Social media can drive traffic to your own platforms and drive to your own website. You can build a loyal community of relevant followers through the social media platforms. You can engage and influence service users and stakeholders directly through direct messaging, for example, on Twitter. But you can amplify and extend the reach of traditional media activity. And we'll talk about how you can link up any press release or outreach to your social media to vastly increase its effectiveness. And also, if you are using Facebook or a more informal social media, you can provide a more human and engaging voice than perhaps you can in a more formal release. Social media has had a huge impact on the way news breaks. Most people now probably get their first knowledge of any story through their social media, certainly younger people. So news travels faster, it proliferates, stories spread more quickly. And if you've got a negative story, an issue that's breaking, this can have an impact, because where you might have had more time in the past, stories can go viral incredibly quickly. And also communities can develop. So you might get an issues-based story, which develops an issues-based community. And that can be quite helpful to you, because then you can engage more directly with a community, which often gather online around certain focal points, you know, certain websites, certain interest groups, and that can be easy. NGOs, you know, non-government organizations, you know, campaign groups, if you like, of which in some cases you are, then you can inform and influence audiences through social media and really build the momentum of a story. And of course, on the journalist side, the journalists are using social media all the time, so they can tap into case studies and find case studies on social media, which they can use. So a really effective outreach to media, or sometimes other external stakeholders, such as, you know, policymakers and other influencers, joining up your social media. So linking everything up. Your press release has linked to your website. The website has the press release on. That has linked to your Twitter or Facebook or other feeds. You use hashtags. So if people are searching certain subjects, such as, for example, the travelers community in Ireland, then having those kind of hashtags means that they can come across your content, even if they weren't directly looking for it. It makes your messaging more discoverable. And of course, the other way you can use social media is to create links to video content, infographics, pictures that are too big, if you like, to post directly onto social media, but you can include a link. For example, you might have a video which you've produced, which you can, your hashtag can link to that. And also, because many other organizations with a similar agenda to you, a similar outlook, you can be quite effective in supporting them. So you can like their postings, and you can like or comment or even retweet or share on LinkedIn, share their content, and therefore you effectively are jumping on their bandwagon, supporting them, and likewise that builds communities so they can support you too. So it's all about building that momentum, building that community of people that support you and go with what you're trying to achieve. You'll be aware, we won't dwell on this, of the various different social media platforms. Twitter is a maximum 280 character, but this can of course include links to longer content. It's useful for regular updates as well. And it can be quite a good way of responding if there's an issue developing around you. LinkedIn, I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn personally. It's much more for business to business, for peer to peer. It's a more serious, but at the same time, it can be very good at reaching targeted groups. I noticed that some of the organizations within and connected to Irish in Britain and Irish Britain itself will use these platforms, particularly LinkedIn, to, for example, publish a report or to publish findings from a membership survey. These kind of things work very well on LinkedIn. Facebook, a little bit more relaxed. Even the big corporations will sometimes use Facebook to publish results. It doesn't have to be informal, but it does give you the opportunity to stay connected in a slightly more informal way. Tone of voice, the way that you talk about yourselves can be quite useful. And then Instagram, probably less important from a policy point of view, but extremely useful for picture-based engagement and video-based engagement. And TikTok, not one I personally use very much, but it is reaching a much younger audience and is mainly for video sharing. Content is king on social media. Good content will spread much sooner. When you're developing content, think about your tone of voice. The values that your organization stands for, that can shine through in your content. You can use your website, if you have one, in conjunction to, put your original content out on your website and then simply link to it via the other platforms. And one of the questions I'm quite frequently asked is, should I respond to social media? If there's a load of social media out there saying bad things about me or about the organization, should I respond? And here's a little matrix I developed, which I think you might find quite helpful. It's in the pack, it's in the toolkit, which is, if it's a rant, if people are just ranting generally about your organization or about an issue, then generally speaking, you don't need to respond to it in any way. What tends to happen is you get a self-leveling effect, where if the rants are unreasonable, other people will join in and say, well, actually, that's unfair. And it sort of balances itself out. If, however, there is incorrect information being put out there, I used to do some work with British Land, who own 100 shopping centres in the UK. There was some information that went out on social media saying that one of the big shopping centres, Blue Water, was closed. This information was wrong. It might have deterred hundreds, if not more than hundreds, maybe thousands of people from going to that shopping centre. It would have a damaging impact. And therefore, it was necessary to put out a correction to say that we are open and we would welcome you, etc. So that sometimes you do need to do that. And sometimes if there's an individual comment or an individual complaint about your organization and the way that perhaps that you treated that, allegedly treated that person, then sometimes it's best to take that offline and deal with that directly through direct messaging rather than join in some group conversation. But where you might need, if there are serious complaints, you probably will need to deal with it in some way. If it's wrong information, you probably should deal with it. But if it's just a rant, sometimes it's best just to ignore it and let it play out. Social media is also very helpful for listening. And you are, Irish in Britain is a listening organization, and I'm sure many of its members are as well. It's a useful way to find out what people are saying about you, what conversations are, how effective your own communication is. So perhaps you can change it if it's not right. And particularly if there's a breaking issue or even a crisis affecting your organization, social listening is quite a good way of finding out where the unhappiness is. Is it a general wide unhappiness, or is it just within a certain community or a certain online community? So listening can be very helpful. Measurement. When I moved over from journalism, one of my first jobs on the other side of the fence was an in-house director of communications. And I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit naive and I didn't really value measurement. I kept thinking, well, look, I know what's successful and what isn't. I know what's got cut through, and I don't need to sort of formally measure it. But actually, we live in a world where you need to engage with your stakeholders, inform your own communities, both internally and externally, and being able to demonstrate how successful your communications has been can be quite a useful strategic tool, both in terms of perhaps securing more support or funding in the future, or for lots of other reasons. And measuring what you've done, I think, breaks down into three main areas. There's inputs, the number of press releases or briefings you've done, the number of events you've held, the number of attendees to those events, roadshows, etc. So you're measuring, if you like, the input. The uptake is how successful that was in terms of the coverage that you got, both online, the number of comments or hits you got on social media. It's what resulted from your inputs. And finally, the hardest one to measure, but is probably the most important, is the outcomes of what you've done. So, for example, with the case of the vaccination program, which Irish in Britain were involved in, one of the outcomes there was that more people got vaccinated. And in the case of the one-day event in Liverpool, some 90 people got vaccinated. So there's a clear outcome as a result of your activity. And all of these things can demonstrate not just that you're doing a good job, although that can be helpful, but help people to understand more about what you're doing and the effectiveness so they can support you and perhaps even use their own communications and their own social media to support what you're trying to achieve. Which brings me on to issues and crisis management. Now, we could spend a whole day on this, and for some clients I do, because it's very, very big subject. And clearly, for a very small organization, you're less likely to come under fire, if you like, than a large organization, but it can happen to anybody. And although no crisis or issue is ever the same, there's always different circumstances, there are nevertheless some tried and tested principles for dealing with one. The first thing is to identify it in the first place. And I think if there's a problem comes up, maybe an MP or someone has raised an issue about you, or it could be something on site, one of your own staff has been involved in something very damaging reputationally, maybe they've been involved in some kind of harassment problem, or there can be a million different things. There are things you can ask yourself to say, well, should I be taking this more seriously as a potential crisis? So you can ask yourself, for example, is the scope of this particular problem likely to become larger than just a local internal issue? Are the media likely to get involved either in the UK or Ireland? Could that happen? Does the problem that's arisen have consequences for the health or safety of colleagues or to the public? In which case it certainly will be a serious issue. Is there on-site issues around your own office or your own surroundings or your own environment, which might be the case, for example, in terms of a fire or a pollution issue of some kind? And will the problem have any regulatory or statutory body consequences? And therefore you might need to, for example, contact the health and safety executive or other bodies, or indeed your own stakeholders. So these are the kind of questions that you need to ask yourselves before you decide whether you want to escalate the situation. And basically, issues and crisis management breaks down to three main areas: prepare, respond, and recover. Preparedness is a very, very important issue for almost any organization, even a very small one. And it's always a good idea to have a small number of people called the crisis management team. That sounds rather grand. It can just be literally 2 or 3 people. And for a small organization, it might even be all of the organization. But it's having a team of people who are ready to deal with anything that might pop up on a negative issue. This small CMT, as we call them, should share all out of office contacts. Most issues happen out of office hours. So that's the mobile, an email, your home phone number. And I would always advise setting up a WhatsApp group of all the people who are on that, so you can deal with each other really, really quickly. If an issue does break and someone identifies an issue, then hold a conference call to assess the situation and start to identify the known facts, track the situation as it develops, and this will help you make the right decision. Now, sometimes the right decision is to do nothing. You don't always have to respond. But if you decide the right thing is to do nothing and sit tight, you still need to be busy, monitoring, carefully watching the situation to see whether it develops. During a developing crisis, you should always take this as the priority for the crisis management team and delegate the day job, if you like, delegate the ongoing situation to other people within your team. This clearly is more relevant for a large organization than a very, very small one. So something's happened. You're under fire and you need to decide whether you communicate at all. What you need to bear in mind is if you don't, then others may fill that gap. So sometimes it can be useful to issue some kind of statement rather than rely on the rumor and misrepresentation that might be filling that space. But on the other hand, you don't want to knee-jerk and start firing a communication out. It really is a question of balance. It's a question of judgment. But what you should be doing is be very proactive in gathering information. Verification of the situation is probably the most important thing you can do. And sometimes organizations respond to what they think is a crisis, but they haven't checked out all the information. And they've either overreacted or they've in some cases responded to the wrong issue because they hadn't done their homework. Remain positive. You are a good organization doing great things. Don't forget that. People sometimes do forget that when they're under fire. If you're a multi-site organization, coordinate and centralize messages between all the sites. Make sure that if you have staff or stakeholders that ought to know about this, don't let them read it online, social media, or worse still, in newspapers or on a radio bulletin. Make sure that you keep them informed. They don't need the detail, but they might need to know that there is an issue because they may be contacted on it as well. And monitor media, local, social, online media to see if anyone is picking this up. The critical first steps are, as far as possible, centralize the management of the situation so everything goes through one small team. What you don't want is one person in the organization saying one thing and then someone who's approached by a journalist saying something completely different somewhere else. That's very damaging. Try and put it all through the prism of one small team or one person. If information, for example, you're being attacked or criticized unfairly, identify the source of that information if you can, verify that source. Very often on social media, the source may have no real credibility or veracity. And if you can establish that, you perhaps don't need to respond quite so robustly. Only act on the information available. Don't speculate. That can create problems. And decide whether you need to manage this up in terms of a board, a non-executives, or in some cases, a regulator, or in some cases, maybe even a government department in the UK or Ireland that ought to be told. Once the crisis is you've responded to it, you've done all the right first steps, meet on regular intervals, constantly assess whether it's time to stand down, keep a record of events. This might be useful further down the line. Keep a record of external content, have a status log, which you can update as a live document, monitor the response, of any information that you release. So you keep a record of that as well, things that you've said, and keep your stakeholders on board if they need to know, which they probably will. So sometimes you get third-party allegations. Someone who doesn't like you says something bad about you. Try and assess the scale of this. Is a response needed at all? Is this person an influencer? Does this person have a large following? Does this person have influence in government or policymakers? If they do, you've probably got to, bear that in mind. Check the facts all right. Do inform Irish in Britain HQ, Judith on the communication side, and Brian and the team, Aisling, because they will have additional resource that might be able to help you and support you. And do make copies of any documents that you put out externally. And then once you've dealt with and managed the situation and everything's got back to normal, it can be useful to review, not a blame game, not a post-mortem as such, but if there were lessons to be learned, could we have done things better? Do we need to sharpen our preparedness next time round? Was it handled well or badly? Lessons learned. And will there be any future comeback? And then finally, if you have taken a bit of a knock, can we, going forward, produce a little proactive campaign, not immediately, but in the future, to try and restore whatever damage was done? So that, in a nutshell, is crisis and issues management. There's much more to it, but they are the basic fundamental principles. And finally, for all the communication that you might be involved in, media, external communication, but particularly the media, I like this quote from Andrew Marr. News is not a pure commodity. It's a buzz. It's not wisdom. It's not balance. It's not the encyclopedia. It's not the full dictionary. It's what's interesting people on the day. At the end of the day, we're all hacks. And that came from Andrew Marr, a highly respected journalist who's written a number of books. I think the point he's making here is that media engagement, external engagement, is an art, not a science. You do, there is tried and tested best practice, which I've covered some of in this presentation. And there are things which are more likely to deliver success and make you more effective. But you can never be 100% sure of the outcome, which is why there's so much skill and so much process involved in good communications. It doesn't replace common sense. None of what I've said today replaces good judgment and common sense. And if you're concerned about something you're putting out, it's a good principle to say, if in doubt, leave it out, play safe. Because increasingly with social media, you might have heard of an expression, tomorrow's fish and chip papers. In other words, it doesn't really matter what appears in a newspaper because it'll cause a problem in the short term, but then tomorrow it'll be wrapping up some fish and chips. In the days, by the way, when fish and chip shops used to wrap their fish and chips in newspaper, they aren't allowed to now because the mineral oil in newsprint is considered to be carcinogenic. But the phrase remains, it's only tomorrow's fish and chip papers. That's not true, because on social media, everything that's said is recorded. And if you put in a Google search, or if you dig deep enough, you will find it somewhere. And sometimes things can come back to haunt you. So it's very good if you can get it right the first time. So some of these practices that we've talked about today will help you do that. So that's really all I wanted to cover today. There's a lot more detail in the toolkit, which will be available to members and partners. So now, if you have any questions, please, now's the time, or maybe Aisling has already received some, or there are one or two questions that I'm generally always typically asked anyway.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Thank you for that fantastic overview. Just to reiterate what Malcolm said, we have a PDF of the toolkit, which we will send around to all members. Just a few questions here, Malcolm, while I think we do have the time. Firstly, can you go off record with a journalist?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's quite a complex question, but the bottom line is, I would say no. Or let me explain that. You can have a friendly chat with a journalist, you can give them some background briefing, but if you've got a piece of information that you really do not want to appear in the public domain, then it's a very risky game to play to give it to a journalist who then promises they won't use it. Because when you think about it, if it's an interesting piece of information which is potentially newsworthy, then you're asking that journalist not to do their job, because their job is to deliver to their audience, whoever reads them, follows them online, or listens to them, or watches them on television. You're asking them not to do their job, which is a big ask. But journalists will sometimes agree to do that because the information that you've given them, although it's interesting, isn't so compelling that they want to run it. But what can happen is you can get a jigsaw effect, whereby the piece of information that you've given them in its own right isn't compelling, but other information comes out, which makes that information suddenly so much more interesting and so much more compelling. And it's a big ask for a journalist not to run that. Also, journalists have bosses like we all do. And, the boss might say, I don't care what you agreed, we're running that story. Are they going to give up their job to protect you? Probably not. So by all means, develop relationships, by all means, give background briefings, but do not impart information which would cause you a real problem if it ever came out.
Thank you, Malcolm. And just, I suppose, following on from what you referred to as the jigsaw effect, what can you do in a situation if you feel a journalist has perhaps misquoted or misrepresented you or your organisation?
Yes, this is a very, very good point. And it's quite difficult, actually, because you need to be absolutely sure first that the journalist has misquoted you and has misrepresented you, because sometimes you think to yourself, I didn't like that. I don't remember saying it, but actually maybe you did. So if you complain to the editor or complain to the Press Complaints Commission or to Ofcom, for example, if it's a broadcast thing, and it turns out that the journalist did record that quote and it is what you said, then that can backfire. But if you're absolutely sure they've misrepresented to you, you should get in touch before you make an official complaint and say, look, I'm sorry, you've misquoted me, or that information that you've just published is wrong. Now, as you've probably noticed, it's extremely rare for a printed newspaper or for a mainstream broadcast news organization to publish a correction. They will do it. They don't like doing it, and it's very unusual when they do. However, what they will gladly do, if they have got it wrong, is correct their online version. So if there's a mainstream media publication of any kind, and there's an online version of it, then it's relatively easy for them to change that. And from my experience, they will, because they're not in the business of reporting the wrong information. If they have made a mistake, they'll be very happy to correct it online so anyone else who reads it will see it. But they're very reluctant to publish a correction as such. If, however, it's a serious matter, it's damaging, and you feel very strongly about it, the next point of call is the editor, who will possibly consider a correction. And if you're still unhappy, if it's print, you go to the Press Complaints Commission, and they will pick it up on your behalf. Or you can contact various regulatory bodies that cover social media. And for example, you can complain if something's wrong on Facebook or Twitter, you can actually try and get it taken down. None of these things are easy. I think the best thing to do, broadly speaking, is to have a sensible conversation with the originator of the content, see if you can persuade them to put the record straight. And even if they can't do it immediately, maybe you can agree with them that further down the line, there will be an opportunity to correct that misrepresentation and put the record straight further down the line.
Lovely, thank you, Malcolm. Malcolm, I wonder, do you have any advice or guidance on how somebody might navigate a situation where they've been approached by a journalist that they weren't expecting, maybe at a meeting or a networking event, who then proceeds, I suppose, try and talk to them about a breaking issue?
Yes. In the business, this is sometimes known as the ambush. And where it can happen typically, many of you will attend events. They could be a sector event, it could be a conference, could be one of the party conferences, for example, or it could be a whole series of different events where different organizations get together, and maybe there's a roadshow, maybe there's a panel, maybe one of your members of your organization is making a speech at an event. These are all quite typical. And a journalist who's at the event tracks you down when you come off the platform or come off the stage and fires a question at you, not about the speech that you've just made, which probably you could handle, but about a breaking event. Maybe it's a political event in Ireland that they want to comment about. Maybe there's a huge furore and there's a call for the Taoiseach to resign or something like that. It could be anything. And the point is, you haven't prepared for this and you're not briefed on it. And you don't even know that the facts which the journalist is basing their question on are true. You could end up responding to something where the journalist is, wrong in their question in the first place. So the first thing to do is maintain your dignity and your calm, because very occasionally you can be ambushed with a tape recorder rolling, or in some cases with a camera rolling. And what you don't want to be seen to be doing is holding your hand up to the camera lens, or running down a corridor in an undignified way, or going through a door which turns out to be the broom cupboard. Then you have to come out of the door again, rather embarrassingly, which has happened several times to politicians. So in other words, very calmly say, look, I appreciate your question. I really I'm not in a position, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on this, or I don't have the information at hand. Can I ask you to contact our office later, and we'll come back to you if you can, if I can. But I don't want to do anything off the cuff. I'm sure you'll understand that's not appropriate. And you do that calmly, and you do it in a dignified way. And you may have to stick to your guns and say it more than once if the journalist is persistent. But to stay, completely calm and dignified about it. If you do agree, okay, I will answer your one question. Never think for a moment that the journalist is just going to ask you one question. They'll agree to it, but then they'll ask you 6 questions. So look, all I'm prepared to say is, and you give this top line, which perhaps is acceptable and not controversial. And then you have to stick to that, because the journalist will then say, okay, that's fine, but just one more thing and one more thing. And eventually you have to get back to your original position, which is, look, you really do need to come back to my office later on and we will clarify the situation. Now, thank you very much. I do need now to get back to my next meeting or whatever. Do it calmly, do it politely, take their contact details so that someone can contact them back later. And even if you aren't going to comment at all, then it's best to think about it first, run it by your office. Because if you've been on a platform or a roadshow, you might not have the full picture of a breaking issue that's suddenly developed. For example, there might be something around legislation concerning travelers, which may or may not be connected to your own organization. Now, these are, as you know, some of you know, are sensitive issues. They can easily be misreported, and you don't want to do that in a hurry. You are happy to make a comment, but you want more time to consider it. So again, you would say, can I come back to you later on this and take their details? The journalist might say to you, yes, that's all very well, but I've got to be on air in 5 minutes, or I've got a deadline right now. That is their problem. It's not your problem. So again, very polite. Well, I'm sorry that I can't give you the information right now, but we will come back to you. Give me your contact details and I will come back to you. So it's tricky being ambushed. It's one of the areas where people probably get themselves into the most trouble. And particularly if you're at an event where there are journalists there for another reason, but because they see you as representing the Irish community or a section of it, they think, okay, I'll ask them about this issue. Stay calm, be firm, and the journalist will respect that eventually, although you may need to stick to your guns for a while.
Thank you, Malcolm. And I suppose naturally following on from that, are there ever any scenarios, or is it ever okay to say no comment and to sort of maintain that stance?
Yes. When you're deciding whether you should make a response to any issue, either proactively or in this case, with this particular question, reactively, there are always going to be a number of options. And one of those options is to say, I don't want to comment on it. And there's a whole series of reasons why you might not be able to comment. But what makes no comment sound so much more reasonable and so much more plausible is if you can give a reason why you can't comment, just rather than just saying no comment. Because no comment sounds terribly defensive. It sounds terribly like you're guilty of something and you're hiding something. And yet there's probably a number of perfectly good reasons why you can't comment. So I'll give you a few examples of that. A journalist might say to you, well, this report's just come out. What's your response to it? Or we've just seen this blog by a member of your organization. What's your response to that comment in this blog or Twitter or whatever? You don't want to comment on that, mainly because you haven't read it and you don't know the context it was made in. So say that rather than just say no comment. You would say, look, I'm very sorry, I haven't read that particular report yet, or I haven't actually seen that blog or read that comment on Twitter. And I'm sure you'll understand that until I've read it and understood the context of which those comments were made, then I really can't say anything, or I really can't comment on them. That sounds so much more reasonable. Another type of question that you wouldn't want to comment on is if you're asked something which is commercially sensitive. So in other words, I understand you've just done a partnership with, I don't know, Microsoft, or a big company, and they're supporting your project. How much is that worth? Look, I'm sure you'll understand that that kind of detail is commercially confidential, and I can't really give you that figure that you've asked for. But what I can say is we're delighted that we're partnering with Microsoft, and we hope to have a good relationship with them in the future. But I can't comment on the figure that you've asked for. Another reason why you can't comment sometimes is because it's an ongoing litigation or an ongoing employment dispute that's going through an industrial tribunal or going through the courts. This is quite a typical area which organizations are approached on. You've got a disgruntled employee, he's fighting an unfair dismissal, for example. For example, it might be sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, or racial discrimination. Then you could say, look, this is an ongoing litigation. It's still going through the courts, or it's still going through a tribunal, and it just isn't appropriate for us to comment at this time because it's still ongoing. Again, you're saying no comment, but you're saying it in such a reasonable way that it almost doesn't sound like a no comment. And finally, you might be asked a question which is just not something that you want to talk about because it's, for example, politically sensitive. Do you think that it's time that Boris Johnson stood down over Partygate because he's clearly a liar? And the way, if you don't want to answer that question, you might want to answer it, but if you don't want to answer it, you simply say, look, that is a political issue. Thankfully, I'm not a politician. I'm here to help X part of our Irish community here. And actually, we're very pleased with what we're achieving this year, but I'm not going to get involved in political discussions. I'm sorry. So all of those are no comments in a funny sort of way. But in each case, and I come back to my initial point was, saying no comment is sometimes the right thing to do. But if you can say why you can't comment, then it's just so much more plausible, and it's so much more likely that your no comment will be understood and received in the right way.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Malcolm. Thank you. Fantastic overview there of the toolkit and some definite takeaways there in the Q&A. Just aware of the time now. So I think we'll probably say a massive thank you for today, and just a reminder that the toolkit will be made available for all members. If there are any questions in the session that hadn't been answered, please feel free to send me an email. But otherwise, a massive thank you, Malcolm, for today. And I think we will probably close today's session now. So thank you very much, Malcolm.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining. I really enjoyed. I hope it was useful. Good luck in the future. Communication is a good thing to do, but do it wisely, do it prudently. And I'll come back to that one point. It never replaces all the things I've talked about. Never replace common sense and good judgment.
Thank you very much. Thanks, folks.